being vegan is one of the most, as I said, important and empowering choices that we can make. And it is challenging to live as a vegan in a dominant animal-eating culture, which daily offends some of our deepest sensibilities. Many vegans carry a tremendous amount of stress simply from living in a culture that is so deeply dysfunctional in its relationship with non-human beings and also with many human beings. And so I'll talk about each of these issues. I'll touch on each of these issues throughout this presentation. So today what I'll specifically be focusing on are some of the key principles and tips for improving all kinds of relationships and communication. This is, friendships, intimate relationships, family relationships, and also relationships between two vegans who can also struggle with some of the same issues that I'll be talking about here today. And I also want to point out that Beyond Beliefs, I wrote Beyond Beliefs in order so that vegans would have something they could actually share with non-vegans in their lives, so that they could, a lot of you guys, I'm sure, have experienced this. Sometimes, just trying to talk about the issue, you end up against this wall of defensiveness, and it can be so difficult. And as time goes on and frustration has built, it can become increasingly difficult to talk about the issue. So in my book, I have chapters, one chapter in particular that's written specifically for non-vegans, but the book really is written to be able to be shared with non-vegans. And I have appendices that you can just photocopy and give to the non-vegans in your life. For example, I have a letter to a non-vegan. Dear non-vegan, this is what the world looks like through my eyes. This is what I wish you would understand about me. To try to simplify this process of communicating about such an intense, often emotionally charged and complex issue in some ways. So I want to just point out also that underneath our different ideologies or belief systems of veganism and Carnism is a relationship between people. And when we're looking at building healthy relationships and communicating effectively, this is where our attention really needs to be. So the first principle I want to talk about is about keeping your relational immune system strong. I talk in my book about what I refer to as a relational immune system that is similar to, I suggest that our relationships are similar to our bodies, in that when we think about our bodies, when our bodies get sick, they get sick when two things happen: when our immune system is weaker than the germ that challenges it. Our relationship gets sick or starts to break down when our relational immune system is weaker than the germ, or in this case, the stress that challenges it. So principle one is to build a strong relational immune system, so that when we do experience stress, we're better able to withstand and bounce back from it. Now, a strong relational immune system is both secure and connected. These two aspects, these are the two foundational elements of a strong relational immune system. And they exist, as you can see here in the image, on a spectrum or on a continuum. It's not that our relationship is either connected or not, or it's secure or not. It's more or less connected or secure. The greater the degree of security and connection in our relationship, the stronger our relational immune system is, and generally the happier and more fulfilled we are in the relationship. Now, relationships are all about needs. If you think about it, we tend to be happy when our needs are being fulfilled, our physical needs, our psychological needs for fun, connection, intellectual stimulation, our emotional needs. We tend to be happy when our relationships are being fulfilled, and unhappy or less happy when our needs are not being fulfilled. Now, I talk a lot in my book about needs and identifying and articulating needs. Here, I want to just touch upon one need, the need for safety. This is the primary need that we have, and this is the need for security. Safety is the bottom line need of needs. And for many vegans, this is a need and the element of the relational immune system that is consistently feels consistently threatened and insecure. For many vegans, traumatic triggers are everywhere. Traumatic triggers are triggers that remind us of a traumatic experience that we've had. And for many of us who have seen the horrors of meat, egg, and dairy production, we've had a traumatic we have a traumatic response to that, and it's hard not to have that imagery in our mind when we're exposed to meat, eggs, and or dairy. So just sitting across from somebody can be very triggering to us when we're watching them eat animals. So one of the things we need to be able to do is to identify and articulate our boundaries. Really get clear about what is and is not tolerable for you in terms of, you being able to feel safe in your interaction or in your relationship with another person. So, for example, I have a script in my book to, help readers think about how they can communicate this need to feel more, or this request for greater safety in their relationship when it comes to not being exposed to these traumatic triggers. So you could say something like this. When I look at meat, eggs, and dairy, imagine you're talking to somebody who you're in a relationship with that's a close enough relationship where it's important that that they understand what the world looks like through your eyes, because you feel insecure in their presence when they're eating animals around you, or when they're serving animals around you, or whatever it may be. So you could say to them, when I look at meat, eggs, and dairy, as much as I try not to, I just can't help but see dead animals' bodies. I can't help but have flashbacks to the horrible videos I've seen about how those animals were raised and killed, and I automatically feel horrified. This is probably how you'd feel if the meat, eggs, and dairy came from dogs and cats. Now, I'm not asking you to become vegan, but just to understand my experience so you understand why it's so important to me to not be exposed to animal products. So a lot of vegans in relationships work really hard to get the people around them to become vegan, and this is totally understandable, and it often doesn't work. One of the things that is really important, however, in relationships for us to be able to do, we can't force other people to change. When we try to make other people change, often they get more resistant. But what we can and we can do and need to do is to ask the people in our lives to empathize with our own experience. We all, when we're in a relationship, at least in a close enough relationship, it's really important that we are committed to understanding the other person's inner world. That's fundamentally respectful, and we can't be connected with somebody when they don't understand our world, internal world, and we don't understand their internal world. So for vegans, it's really important to know, to be able to frame this request, not as a request that the other person become vegan, but as a request that the other person understand veganism enough so that they can understand your world, what the world looks like through your eyes. And many people are much more open to this kind of request, which is, we have the right to make this kind of request. In many people's minds, they can understand a request like this, where they're much more resistant to a request to just become vegan. This is a related issue. Many vegans feel the pain of not being compassionately witnessed. To be compassionately witnessed is to be seen, appreciated with compassion. Many people become vegan and then find that they have to shrink themselves to fit into their relationships, like that they have to hide some of the things that they're most proud of, most passionate about, most excited about, because there's no room in their relationship for that, because they can't share their veganism, because their veganism is misunderstood, or there's resistance against their veganism. And again, it's very important for people in a relationship that has any degree of closeness to know that the other person is willing to witness them, is willing to hear them talk about what's important to them, understands their inner world. And we also have to be willing to do this to the other person as well, to the degree that we're able to. The only time that it's not appropriate to ask for compassionate witnessing is when we're asking for somebody to witness something that makes them feel unsafe. So, for example, it wouldn't be appropriate for a hunter to ask a vegan to compassionately witness them in their hunting. Or another time it's inappropriate is when we're asking for somebody to compassionately witness something that is a violation of their integrity. And I could use the same example as I did before with the hunter. So again, you can make this request of the people in your life. You can take what I wrote, this script in the book, modify it however you like so it's in your own words, and frame it so that you're not asking for the other person to become vegan. You're simply asking them to look at the world through your eyes, so that you make it, clear that your goal is to feel more connected. It's important that I know you understand me. And again, in a similar vein, okay, and these are all ways to enhance the security and connection in our relationships. It's really important that vegans are able to have vegan allies in their lives and to be able to ask for others to become vegan allies. A vegan ally is the term I use for somebody who is not vegan themselves, not fully vegan themselves, but who supports veganism and vegans. We all need to believe and feel that the people in our lives have our backs, that they're standing on the same side that we are, that they are our allies. And many vegans assume that this is not possible unless the other person is vegan themselves already. And I think this is a very problematic framing, where we assume, understandably, but in my opinion mistakenly, that either somebody is vegan and they're part of the solution, or they're not vegan and they're part of the problem. And therefore, they can't be on the same side as the vegan if they're not vegan themselves. When we think about veganism in this black and white way, we prohibit people or we prevent people from becoming a part of the solution, from contributing to the cause, when they might actually be able to make quite a difference for the animals. If we say that the only way to support veganism is by never eating animals again, then we really limit the contributions that could be made to the movement. So, some of the people who I know who have done the most for animals are not vegans. They're journalists who interview me and reach hundreds of thousands of people, sometimes millions of people with their stories. They're philanthropists or just people who donate to my organization so that we can then do vegan outreach. So it's really important for vegans to be able to say to the people in their lives, or know the people in their lives are vegan allies, even if this other person isn't vegan, that they get you as a vegan, that they respect your veganism, that they're not teasing you at the dinner table and laughing along with other people who tease you, that they are your ally. And we need to give people the opportunity to be our allies. And if we assume that they can't be our allies unless they're fully vegan, then we prevent them from recognizing this opportunity. And many vegans will find that their struggle to turn people in their lives vegan was really a struggle to have the people in their lives see them, respect them, and stand by them in what's important to them. And very often it's enough to create connection in a relationship and security in a relationship with somebody who's not vegan, as long as they're respectful of you and your veganism, as long as they're an ally to you. So I have an example here of a way to request a vegan ally. You could say, this is an excerpt, it's a longer script. One thing that would reduce my stress a lot is knowing that even if the rest of the world doesn't understand veganism or me, you do. I'm not asking you to be vegan. I'm just asking you to understand my world so I don't feel so alone. I need to know you're my ally, that you of all people see me, and that you have my back, especially when things are tough. You already do this for me in so many ways, and it's often good if you're asking for an ally to point out, a vegan ally, how they're allies in other ways. So they have something to base it on. So even though you're not vegan, I need to know you understand what veganism is, what it means to me, and what it's like for me to live as a vegan in a non-vegan world. What I think would be most helpful is to be able to share information about veganism with you. And would also be really helpful for me to be able to talk to you about my experience as a vegan when I need to, just like I can talk to you about other things in my life. And so, there's a lot of resistance to taking in information about veganism. We all know this. There's often less resistance when we're not asking people to take this information in because we're trying to convert them to veganism, but rather because we're trying to help them understand us so that we can ultimately feel more connected with them. Now, the second principle is to let integrity be your guide. So integrity is the integration of core moral values and practices. And in my book, I talk about how integrity is the North Star, essentially, of security and connection. The more we practice integrity, the more secure and connected we feel in our relationships. And this is something that you can do even if the other person isn't willing to do that. You have a choice. We all have choices in our relationships. If the other person isn't willing to meet us halfway and isn't willing to be a compassionate witness and be receptive and practice integrity after we've been consistently doing this, then that's important information that we have about the person and about our relationship. So integrity is basically, as I said, it's practicing the integration of core moral. It's the integration of core moral values and practices. And I talk about practicing the 3 C's of integrity: curiosity, which is an open mind; compassion, which is an open heart; and the courage to be authentic and to be vulnerable and to show up in a relationship. The courage not to play the game of let's pretend, which most of us are pretty good at and which we learn to do through our socialization. Central to the practice of integrity, and one of the key reasons that it helps us to feel more secure and connected in our relationships, is because when we practice integrity, it helps us to avoid judging and shaming, which is the Achilles heel, or are the Achilles heels of a relationship or of a relationship resilience. Shame is not the same as guilt. Guilt is the feeling that we have when we've done something bad. So guilt is, I did something bad. It's how we feel about a behavior. Shame is the feeling that we have when we believe we are bad. So shame is the belief I am bad, not I've done something bad. Shame is the feeling of being less than, or more specifically, it's the feeling of being less worthy than. Shame is arguably the most disruptive of all human emotions. Shame is such a disruptive emotion to our sense of self, and so painful that most of us will do just about anything to avoid this feeling. I always say that one of the best ways to get somebody to do the opposite of what you want is to shame them. Shamed people are not people who feel a sense of agency and inspiration to take positive action on their own and others' behalf. Shamed people typically, wrap themselves in the emotional armor necessary to prevent themselves from being further shamed. Shamed people withdraw or attack in self-defense. Judgment is the mental counterpart to shame. Judgment, when we're in a place of judgment, we are positioning ourselves as superior to the other, essentially morally superior, or often morally superior. The less we shame and judge, the healthier, the stronger our relational immune system is. The more we practice integrity, the less we shame and the less we judge in our relationships. So one of the most important things that we can commit to doing in our relationships with others, with other vegans, with non-vegans, and also toward or with ourselves, is to reduce the shaming attitudes and behaviors that we engage in, to honor the dignity of the other and to honor the dignity of ourselves. Basically, to see ourselves as fundamentally worthy and to see others as fundamentally worthy, not better than, not less than. And I'm going to talk about some of the ways to do this. And I do talk quite extensively in my book about, real practices for how to do this, how to avoid engaging in shaming behaviors. One of the most important ways is to learn the principles of effective communication, which I talk about quite a bit, obviously, in my book. And I'll give you some examples here on ways to effectively communicate and communicate in a way that reduces the likelihood that what we say will be shaming and disconnecting. Shame is an extremely disconnecting emotion. So we can focus on process over content, and this will reduce the chances that our communication is shaming and increase the chances that our communication is connecting. All communications have these two components. The content is what we are communicating about, the subject, and the process is how we are communicating. People tend to remember more and react more to the process than to the content. So like if you think about a conversation you had a week ago or a month ago, for example, you might not remember any of the content at all, but you probably remember how you felt in that communication. When our process is healthy, we can talk about just about anything without arguing. And when our process is unhealthy, we can't talk about just about anything without arguing. A healthy process has as its goal mutual understanding. In other words, when I'm engaging in a healthy communicative process, my goal is for you to understand my thoughts and feelings and needs, and to understand your thoughts and feelings and needs. That's it. It's not to change you. My goal is not to be right. It's not to win. It is mutual understanding, which creates a sense of connection. When our process is unhealthy, we can have all sorts of goals. Very often our goal is to be right or to win, which means to make the other person wrong or to lose. So we need to avoid debating ideas and instead make our goal mutual understanding. And this is tricky, and it's also very important. This is what happens when we start talking about eating animals or not eating animals. We get really caught up in the content, and the process often goes out the window. But if we're really committed to a healthy process, then we can openly listen to one another and come to mutual understanding, and then hopefully make positive, informed, healthy choices from there. Another practice of healthy communication is to avoid, a practice to avoid is to not define reality. Defining reality is basically saying what is real or true for somebody else. It's making ourselves an expert on the other person's experience. Most of us act like we're mind readers when we're not. We communicate as though we actually know what somebody else's motivations are, or what their thoughts are, their feelings, or their needs. This one act of defining reality and acting like we're experts on somebody else's experience gets us into a lot of trouble. And if we could eliminate this, suspend disbelief, allow others to be the experts on their own experience always. If we could do this one thing, it could really transform our relationships. So, for example, the non-vegan says, I love animals. And the vegan says, no, you don't. You eat them. And this happens all the time. How does the vegan know? How do we possibly know what somebody else feels, especially if they've just told us otherwise? Who are we to contradict what somebody else says that they feel? Or the non-vegan says, I want to get healthier, and the vegan says, no, you don't. You always eat garbage. So, of course, non-vegans do this to vegans as well. It goes both ways, and it's important to avoid defining reality regardless as to what we're talking about or who we're communicating with. Another way we can communicate when the non-vegan says, I love animals, is to say something like, well, that's great to hear. The animals in this world have a really hard time of it, and they need all the compassion they can get. I actually care about animals too, and that's what led me to eventually become vegan. So there are different ways to respond, obviously, to the same statement, and what we focus on in another person will grow. If we want to grow compassion in them, we need to focus on the compassion within them. The fourth principle is to identify the germ or the stressor of carnism. Carnism is the invisible belief system that conditions people to eat certain animals. A lot of you listening probably know about carnism by now. Carnism creates a certain mentality in non-vegans. And I talk in my book about how carnism triangulates relationships, meaning it becomes a third invisible element in a relationship of two that changes the dynamic of the relationship. So it's a relationship between a vegan, a non-vegan, and then carnism, which is this third disruptive element. So we need to recognize these carnistic defenses, psychological defense mechanisms. They distort perceptions of animal products so that, non-vegans look at a hot dog and they see food rather than a dead animal. And they also distort non-vegans' perceptions of vegans. And so there's this, as I said, this automatic defensiveness and stereotyping of a vegan who may be in a close relationship with that non-vegan. And this creates a major stress on the relationship. So, for example, we could recognize how carnism distorts perceptions of needs so that neutral requests are perceived as unfair demands. I talk a lot in my book. I have a whole chapter on how carnism triangulates relationships and all the various ways that it does this unbeknownst to the people in the relationship, often both the vegan and the non-vegan. So, a vegan might very innocently say, would you please keep the cheese on the side of the salad so I can eat some too? This is a neutral request, which can easily be perceived as an unfair demand. The vegan is perceived as saying, you better not put any cheese on that salad of yours and go vegan, you lousy meat-eating hypocrite. This is a common experience, one of many experiences that vegans have, where for many vegans, it's quite difficult to assert your needs. We end up being framed as picky eaters, as controlling, as demanding, et cetera, et cetera. So recognizing these carnistic defenses can make a tremendous difference. Principle 5 is to identify the related germ of STSD. STSD stands for secondary traumatic stress disorder, which is just like PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, except that it affects not the direct victims of violence, but the witnesses to the violence. Carnism is a global atrocity. And when we become vegan, we open ourselves up to the reality that we are living in this mass traumatic event that is going on every second of every day. And it can take a toll and have a pretty significant impact on us psychologically and emotionally. So, some of the symptoms of STSD or secondary traumatic stress, it's not always a disorder, include emotional dysregulation. That means we might feel too much. We might feel not enough. We get emotional for what seems to be no reason, or we're numbed out. We can feel like our efforts are never enough and get increasingly compulsive around our work. We may have intrusive thoughts, which are just images of animals suffering, graphic images that we've seen that intrude into our minds when we don't expect them. We can feel guilty for feeling good, and we end up increasingly misanthropic. So in my book, I have a whole chapter on STSD, the impact it has on vegans, and also the impact it can have on vegans' relationships with ourselves, with other vegans, and with the non-vegans in our lives. One of the things that I talk about in the book is what I refer to as the trauma narrative. In other words, when we become traumatized, it's like we can end up seeing the world as one giant traumatic event with only 3 roles to be played: victims, perpetrators, or heroes. And when we have this trauma narrative, we start looking at the world through the lens of trauma and putting people and animals into one of these roles with no wiggle room, no room for human fallibility for example, at all, and we exaggerate our perceptions of each of them. So if we're in a relationship with a non-vegan, and they're sitting down and they're eating meat in front of us, we can very quickly, our perception of them can very quickly go from, this to this in our minds. When we recognize the trauma narrative and how it impacts us and our relationships and our relationship with ourselves, we are less hijacked by it. We create some space between ourselves and the narrative. We also need to avoid moral perfectionism, and moral perfectionism can be a component as well of secondary traumatic stress, where we start to feel like we have to be perfect. Part of this is because many vegans feel guilty feel survivor guilt around what's happening to the animals as a result of what's happening to animals. Survivor guilt is the guilt that people feel when they've survived a traumatic event and others have perished. And I'm moving a little quickly. We started a bit late, and I want to make sure that I get through everything, and we still have time for some questions. So the sixth principle is to practice acceptance. Acceptance is a generosity everyone deserves. Acceptance does not mean we don't hold people accountable. Acceptance does not mean we accept disrespectful behavior. Acceptance doesn't mean that we accept that we will live with anything. Acceptance simply means accepting a person for who they are and not judging their character, even as we may disagree with their behaviors and we may ultimately choose to not engage with them because of their behaviors. When we practice acceptance, we can appreciate that the facts don't often sell the ideology of eating animals. We often, sorry, I moved too quickly. We recognize that, good people can participate in harmful practices and it doesn't make them bad people. They are part of this system of Carnism where they have been deeply conditioned to think and feel and behave in certain ways. And people don't change from those patterns until they're ready to change. It also helps us appreciate that we don't need to and really shouldn't work so hard to turn those closest to us vegan. Often they're the hardest people to influence in the first place because of many reasons, one of which is that deeply entrenched power dynamics already exist. Instead, I suggest let impact be your guide. If you want to do vegan outreach, which is incredibly important, reach out to the low-hanging fruits. So many of us spend so much of our time and energy thinking, if I could just crack that nut, just get Uncle Bob to go vegan, just crack through that. There's a heart of gold in there somewhere. If I could just get him to go vegan, I'll have succeeded. And all that energy could have been spent reaching out to many other people who may well have been much more receptive to the message. So we need to give ourselves permission to love non-vegans, even if we don't love what they do, to accept them for who they are as beings while still making it clear what we expect in terms of allyship in our own lives and asking them to bear witness to at least to us. And if we do want to ask people to move towards vegans, I always suggest that we encourage others to be as vegan as possible. Rather than simply say, go vegan. Often if we just say go vegan, we end up with people being very resistant, and it can seem like too much for people. If we ask for people just to reduce, then reduction can be seen as an end in and of itself. If we encourage others to be as vegan as possible, we give them permission to be the experts on their own experience. We give them permission to change in a way that feels sustainable for them, and we are really encouraging them to be self-reflective at every meal. And frankly, if everyone in the world were as vegan as possible, the world would quite quickly become vegan. And we also need, finally, to honor ourselves. It is challenging, as I said earlier, being a vegan in a dominant animal-eating culture, and it takes a tremendous amount of compassion and courage to do so. We are all pioneers in this movement, and we are, our efforts are not for nothing. We're creating a better world for animals, and we're creating a better world for the vegans who will come after us, who won't have to read books on how to communicate with non-vegans who won't have to go through the struggles that we have been going through. So we're creating a better world for future generations of vegans. And I really feel very clear, based on my knowledge of the psychology of social change and having been in this movement for a long time, that veganism will replace Carnism one day as the dominant ideology. The question in my mind is not whether, but really when. So I think it's really important for vegans to honor themselves, to really understand, deeply understand and appreciate the courage and the character that it takes to live and speak your truth in a culture that is encouraging us all the time to slip back into the carnistic cocoon of unknowing and follow the path of least resistance. This is something to be very, very proud of. So I just want to thank all of you out there. It's great that I'm doing this during Activist Appreciation Month. And thank you, Lisa, for the great work you're doing. Thank all of you for being a part of the solution and for making the world a better place. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Melanie. This is such a treat to have you with us today. And also, I really enjoyed your webinar. I personally learned so much from all of the information that you shared. I particularly like the idea and the concept of the allies, and have even found myself that effort of trying to convince those closest to me has been the most challenging, and I prefer to go for the low-hanging fruit as well. So I'm wondering if you are open to a few questions, if you
Sure thing.
like to
Absolutely.
do that. We have a few that are available in our chat box, and if anyone would like to add another, that is fine too. And looks like one of the questions is, so there was one that was asking that if she was saying she has struggles at work, and that if a non-vegan coworker, say, gets sick, it's someone else's fault, but if she gets sick, it's more related to her diet. That, and I think that might be a concern for many vegans, that we all have to be in perfect health all the time because we're the poster children.
Yeah, and I write about that in my book as well, that, there's that Carnism, one of the ways that Carnism maintains itself is by using this particular type of defense mechanism. I call them secondary carnistic defenses. They're defenses that are designed to invalidate veganism, to invalidate the vegan message. And one of the ways it does this is through creating stereotypes and distorted perceptions of vegans, and challenging experiences for vegans. So many vegans feel that they have to live up to this impossible ideal, that they can't get sick. As soon as a vegan has the sniffles, they're told that this is because of their diet. But the guy next door who had open heart surgery is, it's assumed that he's just got bad genetics. And so many vegans feel tokenized, and that they have to be these perfect representatives for an entire movement. And that puts a tremendous amount of pressure on vegans. And it's completely unrealistic. So recognizing it as part of, the defensive structure of Carnism is a first step. And then using this as a way to communicating with this in mind can be really helpful. So if somebody says that to me, I say, it's funny, I'm a vegan. As soon as I have the sniffles, it's my diet. But, this guy who had a heart attack has bad genetics. You figure out what makes the most sense to you. And it's also carnistic humor, hostile humor, is very challenging for many vegans to deal with. I have a section in my book about dealing with hostile humor and recognizing hostile humor, but it's really, for many vegans, it's understanding that these are defensive mechanisms, these are defense mechanisms, and then developing the sound bites to be able to respond to them.
Thank you for addressing that. That is very helpful. And I think one other question, we have a couple more, but one that is from Marta. She says that one of her biggest struggles, which I think you addressed in your presentation, are friends who still eat meat and don't understand why it's a big deal to her. She feels distant and disconnected from them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, so part of it, a big part of it is framing the conversation so that it is actually about the relationship and not about the ideology. Not like, I want you to understand veganism so you can understand why eating animals is wrong, but I want you to understand veganism so you understand me, because it's central to my life. And starting out with that, that's, that's your lead into the conversation. Like, I really would love to talk to you about this. This is so fundamental to my life, veganism. It's so much a part of who I am that if you don't really understand this, and they don't have to have a huge understanding of it, but if you don't have an understanding of this, you don't have an understanding of me. And I will feel like you will not really be able to get me. And I would really love to be able to share information with you simply so you know what the world looks like through my eyes and you have a better understanding of the choices that I've made and what matters to me. And be willing to do this again for the other person as well, within those limits that I talked about before.
Thank you, Melanie. Here's another one. The question is from Jeremy, and he's asking, can you explain the research that supports the reducitarian approach?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, Tobias Lehnert, my colleague who just published the book, How to Create a Vegan World, goes into that in more detail than I could go into now. But basically it's, psychologically for many people, and sometimes vegans can actually understand this if they put themselves in a different scenario, but asking people, depending on the person, for some people, suggesting that they become vegan, or I always say as vegan as possible, is not terribly unrealistic. But for many people, even if it's practically possible to become vegan, it may not feel psychologically possible to become vegan. And so, what we know is that most people, when it comes to making food transitions or this type of food transition, do tend to transition slowly. People who do transition in a more sustainable way are more likely to stick with the dietary changes that they make. I personally do not approach somebody and say I advocate reducing. Sometimes I might use that word, but I generally tend to frame it as vegan as possible, because then it makes it clear that veganism is the end goal, and it's honoring, it's not defining the other person's reality. It's not saying go vegan, I know what's possible for you. So like, just an example, I have known people in the past who are fruitarian, and they genuinely believe that eating only fruits, or plants that are fruit-bearing, food from plants that are fruit-bearing, is the healthiest way to live, and it's also the most ethical way to live. And I was in this conversation at one point with a couple of people around this. They felt very strongly. And I said, it's not possible for me to be fruitarian. And they were like, but yes, it is. You have enough money, you have access to fruit. I was living in Boston. It's a cold climate. And that's true. It would have been possible for me to be fruitarian, but it didn't feel possible for me. I would have felt so deprived that it didn't feel possible for me. So what is possible on a practical level, if you completely change your life, is not necessarily possible on a psychological level, or certainly not sustainable, I should say. It doesn't feel sustainable.
Thank you for sharing that example. That definitely helps to put it in context. Let's see a couple other quick questions. One is that Jose says that he's participating in his first Cube of Truth this Saturday and is wondering if you have any recommendations to be an effective conduit for the vegan message with strangers.
All of the principles that I talk about, I mean, the Cube of Truth is a uniquely set up campaign form of outreach. So I probably, in this time that I have, can't really do justice to the answer. I will do the answer justice, but I will say that when you do get to the point where you're engaging with people, I mean, I've talked about this on my sustainable activism presentation. You know, it's important not to shock people with traumatic material and have them give consent to witness it. When you do finally communicate and engage with people, you know, these same principles of effective communication matter. Connection needs to come first. People will not be receptive to what you say unless they feel connected to you, and they won't feel connected to you unless they feel that you are committed to a healthy process, that you genuinely want to understand where they're coming from, and that you're seeking mutual understanding rather than trying to force them to change.
Thank you. We have another question about children, actually. If you have any advice for kids, how to help them with relationships with other kids at school.
Yeah, I mean, often we talk to children as though they're less capable of understanding things than they actually are. It's a good idea to talk to your kids. I mean, it depends on how old they are. They're obviously old enough to have relationships with kids at school, to keep them really informed about why they're not eating animals, and to, you know, provide them sound bites, to provide them answers to the questions that they're going to be getting from the kids. I mean, most of us vegans have heard it's the same 7 or 8 defensive questions that we get over and over and over again. Where do you get your protein? What about all the animals? You know, so to really provide the children with tools for, number one, understanding deeply enough why their veganism matters so much, to feel empowered as vegans, and also to help them understand defensive comments, you know, so they can identify, this is a defensive comment, this is a stereotype of vegans. I have a list of these in my book, and so that they recognize those defensive comments, they don't internalize them. So if they're called overly sensitive animal lovers, you know, they can immediately identify, no, that's a carnistic defense, that's not who I am. So to really provide them with information and to provide them with the, you know, the sound bites, the short answers to the most common questions, and to listen to them at the end of the day, to be that compassionate witness for them so that they can process what they've heard or experienced and get support.
Wonderful. And I know we're coming towards the end. We have a couple of other questions. One of them that I think really applies to our audience today is what tricks do you do personally to keep your activism sustainable?
I have a whole presentation on sustainable activism, and I try to practice a lot of what I have you know, I talk about in that, and I'll give you just a couple of examples, and this is something that, you know, I have to be mindful of myself. We all have to kind of remind ourselves, because it's so easy to not be sustainable. The norm in the movement, in the vegan movement, is unsustainable activism. But you know, as you become more self-aware, it's much easier to practice sustainable activism because you're tuned into your thoughts and your feelings and your needs. Sustainable activism is the number one thing that any of us can do to keep our activism sustainable is to identify and attend to our own needs. The more we can do that, the more sustainable our activism is. And if we are committed to looking inside, I meditate every day, I exercise regularly, I create space in my life every day so that there's room for me to know what's happening inside of me, what I need. And then I do my best to attend to that need. And I surround myself with healthy people. I surround myself with people who are pretty emotionally healthy and who are committed to emotional health, so that if I do start to slip, if I'm writing a new book or something and getting caught up and consumed, my husband can tap me on the shoulder and say, hey, no, like, this has been going on for too long, and I think it's time for us to take a day off together, or whatever. But you need to build something in every single day. It's not just about taking weekends off. It's about creating space in your life every day so that you can look inside, see what you need, and ideally give yourself that whatever you need, that quiet that you need, that walk in the park that you need, whatever it is.
Beautiful. Well, thank you so much, Melanie, for sharing all of your amazing wisdom with us. I know there are a couple other questions, so I just wanted to say if you do have further questions, I posted in the chat box a link to Melanie's assistant Flavia, and she'll make sure that Melanie gets some of these questions. And it's been such a delight to have you today, especially at this Valentine's week where we're all learning about loving others and remembering to love ourselves through practicing self-care and compassion for ourselves. And I also would like just to let folks know that we do have some great support services available to you. One of them is a support line where people can call in, and the number there is 800-705-0425, and you're welcome to call us if you're having one of these struggles that Melanie described. You can call our counselors and get some free responses, and you can go through these situations. And I think that would be a wonderful way to kind of practice and get feedback on some of these skills. And another thing that I'd like to mention is that we do have coming up this Thursday another webinar. This one's on mindfulness, so you can continue learning about self-care and by practicing some mindfulness, which will happen with Lainey Mulerath. That will be on the 15th, which is in just a day or two, a couple days. And thank you, Melanie, so much. I really encourage everyone to get her book. I have a copy and I'm going through it, and I'm so enjoying all of the concrete examples and tools that you've provided in the book. So I definitely will be recommending it to people who call the support line, and to friends and other people who are around me who might become a vegan ally.
Well, thank you. And I'm looking at the comments in the chat box and feeling incredibly inspired and grateful thank you guys for your lovely comments. It really recharges my vegan batteries. So have a wonderful, I guess it's daytime for you. A wonderful day.
Yes, thank you, Melanie. Have a nice evening.
Thanks.
And we are so grateful to you for sharing your wisdom with us and spending some time with our sustainable activism community. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye. Take care. Thanks, everyone.